He buried an empty casket for his daughter 3 years ago. No leads, no answers, just a pair of tire tracks and the scent of rain. But this morning, Mason Briggs found Clara's boots, warm, dusted with dew, and sitting in the stall where her horse used to sleep. Then came the note, the warnings, the shadows that spoke in his voice. What started as grief became a reckoning with something ancient, something buried beneath his land. And when his daughter finally returned, she wasn't alone. Some gates don't open, they awaken, and this one remembers blood. Mason Briggs didn't scare easy. The ranch had been in his family since the land was first claimed under a sky so wide it could swallow a man whole. Storms, drought, disease, he'd endured it all with the quiet resilience carved into the bones of every Briggs before him. But nothing had hollowed him out like the disappearance of his daughter. 3 years ago, Clara had vanished on the eve of her 18th birthday. No note, no signs of struggle, just a set of tire tracks by the gate and the scent of rain on the air. Sheriff chalked it up to a runaway. Teenage girls do this kind of thing, they said. Mason never believed it. Clara wasn't the type to leave without feeding the horses, let alone without saying goodbye. Since then, time had moved like treacle. Mason kept the ranch running, barely. He spoke little, drank too much, and only found comfort in routine. Every morning at dawn he checked the stables. Every night he locked them up. Nothing ever changed, until this morning. The barn smelled like dust and hay and the faint iron scent of old blood. As Mason walked the length of the row, boots heavy on the warped planks, something made him stop dead. Stall 7, the old mare's stall, empty since Clara disappeared. And there, sitting just inside the threshold, were her boots, scuffed leather, worn laces, the left one still bearing the faint trace of a sunflower she'd stitched when she was 12. Mason didn't breathe, didn't blink. The air shifted. He could feel it, like the moment before a lightning strike, the world holding its breath. He reached for the boots with trembling fingers. They were warm. Mason jerked his hand back like he'd touched a stove. He stared down at the boots, disbelief clashing with a gut-deep certainty. They weren't just hers. They were recently worn. The scuff marks were fresh. Dust clung only to the soles. One of the laces was still damp, like someone had walked through morning dew. But Clara had been gone 3 years, declared missing, presumed dead. The local search teams had combed every ridge and hollow from Mason's land to the edge of the county line. He'd buried an empty casket the following spring just to give her a place to rest, even if only in memory. So how in God's name were her boots sitting in the old stall? He backed out of the stable, his heart hammering so loud he barely heard the wind outside. The horses were restless, snorting, stomping, swaying like they sensed something unnatural. The air had changed. He could taste it, coppery and sharp. Like a storm coming, but the skies overhead were clear and cruelly blue. Mason scanned the barn. No other signs of disturbance, no boot prints in the hay, no slats of wood disturbed. The heavy latch on the side door was still bolted shut from the inside. His hand went to the revolver at his hip, the one he hadn't drawn since Clara disappeared. He didn't believe in ghosts, but he knew something was wrong. He picked up the boots, held them close. The scent hit him like a punch, cinnamon and cedar. The smell of Clara's old shampoo, the one she'd used when she still plaited her hair in braids and sang to the horses. He staggered back, knees weak, and nearly dropped them. Then he saw it. Something small, pale, and folded in the bottom of the left boot. A note. His hands shook as he unfolded the scrap of paper. It was torn, water-stained, but the handwriting was unmistakable. "Daddy, don't trust the man in the green truck. I think he followed me from the rodeo. If anything happens, I love you. Tell Whiskey I'm sorry. Clara." Mason felt his knees buckle. Whiskey was Clara's horse, the same mare that hadn't eaten for 3 days after her rider vanished, the same one that had stood in stall 7 until she finally had to be put down from grief and age. She hadn't just lost her rider. She'd known Clara was in danger, and no one had listened. The man in the green truck, Mason remembered him now, some drifter passing through town that summer asking questions about the ranch, said he was looking to buy feed in bulk. Tall, with hands too smooth to know cattle and eyes too dead to trust. Drove a battered Chevy with rusted panels and an out-of-state plate. He hadn't seen him again until a month ago. Mason felt ice crawl down his spine. He had seen that truck again, just a glimpse, parked off the side of the back road near the old irrigation canal. He'd thought it was a coincidence, just another passerby. But now, boots in hand and blood thundering in his ears, he knew better. Clara had tried to warn him, and someone had been back to the ranch recently. Mason rose to his feet, rage kindling where grief had long lived. The wind picked up, scattering hay and dust across the yard. From deep in the nearby woods, a branch snapped. Something, or someone, was out there, watching, waiting. Pastor may have guarded the barn in the last story, but this time Mason was the sentinel, and whoever had taken Clara, if they'd come back for unfinished business. They were about to find out the Briggs family didn't bury their dead easy. Mason didn't sleep that night. He sat in the kitchen, boots still caked with dirt, the note from Clara spread across the table like a relic from another life. Outside, the wind moaned through the dying trees, but it wasn't the weather that unsettled him. It was the silence in the stables. The horses didn't make a sound after sundown, no snorting, no pawing, not even the creak of shifting weight. It was like they were holding their breath, like they knew something had changed. Again. The boots, Clara's boots, sat on the porch, still dusty, still warm when he'd found them. He'd checked the security camera after dusk. Motion sensor hadn't triggered. But the wire looked frayed, clipped. Mason lit another cigarette, his sixth since sunset, and stared out through the dirty glass of the kitchen window. He saw it again, the same shape, the same stillness in the tree line. Just a silhouette. No movement. But it was there. The same place the green truck had been last month. He rose, slowly, took down the Winchester from its rack above the fireplace. It hadn't been fired in years. He checked the chamber anyway. Still loaded. He stepped onto the porch. The wind was sharp and mean. Coyotes howled somewhere deep in the basin, but closer down by the stables, it was still. Too still. Mason moved like a ghost through the yard, the gravel crunching beneath his boots the only sound. When he reached the stables, he saw something that stopped him cold. Stall 7, where Clara's boots had reappeared, was open again. He knew he'd latched it. His fingers remembered the feel of the old iron bolt. And inside, Whiskey's bridle hung from the post. But Whiskey had been dead for over 2 years. His heart thudded in his chest as he stepped closer. The smell hit him first. Not rot, not blood. Leather and lilac. Clara's old riding lotion. She used to rub it into Whiskey's neck after long rides. He hadn't smelled it since the week she vanished. Then he saw it. Hoof prints. Fresh, deep. Leading out the back of the stall and into the corral. Only one set. Large, familiar, horse prints. But no horse. He followed them, past the broken fence line where Whiskey used to run. The moon cast long shadows across the paddock, silvering the hills like bones under thin skin. The tracks led toward the old ravine and vanished. Just stopped. As if the horse had taken flight. Mason stood there, breathing hard, rifle slung low in his hands, mind racing through half-remembered stories his grandfather used to tell. About ghosts that didn't know they were dead. About warnings that came from the mouths of animals. About spirits that used familiar faces to lure men into the dark. Something out here was using Clara's memory like bait. And Mason wasn't about to get reeled in without answers. He turned back toward the house, but froze, because the kitchen light was on. And Mason never left the kitchen light on. Someone was inside. He crouched low in the shadows near the woodshed, every sense sharp as cut glass. From this angle, he could just make out movement behind the kitchen curtain. A figure pacing slowly, deliberately. No light from a flashlight. No rustle of drawers. Whoever it was, they weren't looking for valuables. They were waiting. Mason's jaw clenched. His house had been his sanctuary, even in grief. The thought of someone violating that space sent a pulse of fury through his chest. He slid along the fence line, staying in the dark, boots silent in the gravel. There was a side entrance near the root cellar, hidden from view. He used it now, moving like a man who'd stalked coyotes in snowstorms. He entered the mudroom and listened. Just the quiet creak of floorboards. The wind outside died down suddenly, like the world was leaning in to listen. He raised the Winchester, stepped through the doorway. The figure turned. Mason's heart nearly stopped. It was Clara, or someone who looked exactly like her. Same long dark hair, same wide, tired eyes, same black riding jacket she'd worn the night she vanished. But her face, God, her face, it was too pale, too still. And yet the boots she wore were caked in fresh mud, the same boots he'd found in stall 7. "Clara," he croaked, the word unfamiliar on his tongue. The girl didn't speak, just stood there framed by the kitchen window, moonlight pouring in behind her. A tear rolled down her cheek, and when it dropped, it made no sound. Then she opened her mouth, but it wasn't a voice that came out. It was a sound, a guttural low rumble like wind echoing through a cavern. The lights in the kitchen flickered and died. Mason's finger twitched on the trigger, but he didn't fire. Couldn't. His brain screamed this wasn't right. This wasn't Clara. But every part of him wanted it to be, needed it. She raised one hand slowly and pointed toward the hallway, toward the stairs. Then she vanished. No footsteps, no breath, no sound. Just gone. Mason stood frozen in the dark, his chest heaving, his hands shaking. But his legs moved. Slowly, deliberately, he followed the direction she'd pointed. The hallway stretched longer than he remembered, like the house itself had grown with grief. Each step felt like walking into a memory. At the top of the stairs, the door to Clara's bedroom was open. It hadn't been opened since she disappeared. Mason had left it exactly as she'd left it, the posters on the wall, the riding ribbons, the old pair of jeans still draped across the chair. But now, something new sat on the bed, a shoebox. He entered, his breath fogging in the sudden chill. The window was wide open. Wind blew the curtains like reaching fingers. He stepped closer to the bed and opened the box. Inside, a small cloth pouch of reddish dust. A Polaroid photograph of Clara standing beside a man with a beard and mirrored sunglasses. Mason didn't recognize him. A faded map with one location circled in red, the old mine in Black Hollow Ridge, and finally another note. This one written in frantic, uneven letters. He's not done, the man with the mirror eyes. The mine wasn't dead, it was buried. Like me, bring fire, bring faith. He can't hide in the dark much longer. See, Mason dropped the note, his knees nearly buckled. Something cold moved through the room, brushing his neck like icy breath. The closet door creaked. He turned, raised the rifle. And from the darkness behind the door, a voice whispered, not Clara's, a man's, gravel thick, serpent smooth. You should have left the boots where you found them. Mason didn't hesitate. He pulled the trigger. The blast from the Winchester rocked the room. The closet door blew inward with a roar, splinters flying into the shadows. But when the smoke cleared, the closet was empty. No blood, no body, just rows of old flannel shirts, Clara's dusty riding helmet, and a shadow that felt wrong. The air in the room turned heavy, oppressive, the kind of weight that settles over graves and battlefields. The photograph on the bed curled inward, blackening at the edges. The red circle on the map began to smolder. Mason backed out of the room, heart pounding, lungs burning. As he reached the top of the stairs, a shrill scream ripped through the house, not human. It was the sound of metal being torn apart, of wind howling through a corpse's throat. It came from outside, from the barn. Pastor would have gone in first if he were still alive, Mason thought grimly. Instead, he was alone, with a rifle, a warning, and a growing sense that Clara's disappearance had never been about one girl or one crime. Something ancient had stirred, something old and buried and hungry. He grabbed the map and the pouch of red dust from the shoebox, slung his old lantern from its hook by the back door, lit it with a trembling hand. Then he headed toward the barn. Mason didn't hesitate. He pulled the trigger. The blast from the Winchester rocked the room. The closet door blew inward with a roar, splinters flying into the shadows. But when the smoke cleared, the closet was empty. No blood, no body, just rows of old flannel shirts, Clara's dusty riding helmet, and a shadow that felt wrong. The air in the room turned heavy, oppressive, the kind of weight that settles over graves and battlefields. The photograph on the bed curled inward, blackening at the edges. The red circle on the map began to smolder. Mason backed out of the room, heart pounding, lungs burning. As he reached the top of the stairs, a shrill scream ripped through the house. Not human. It was the sound of metal being torn apart, of wind howling through a corpse's throat. It came from outside, from the barn. Pastor would have gone in first if he were still alive, Mason thought grimly. Instead, he was alone, with a rifle, a warning, and a growing sense that Clara's disappearance had never been about one girl or one crime. Something ancient had stirred, something old and buried and hungry. He grabbed the map and the pouch of red dust from the shoebox, slung his old lantern from its hook by the back door, lit it with a trembling hand. Then he headed toward the barn. The night swallowed sound. No insects chirped, no coyotes howled. Just the crunch of gravel under Mason's boots and the soft hiss of flame inside the lantern. The barn loomed ahead like a tombstone. The stall doors were open, all of them. The horses were gone, vanished. No broken gates, no kicked boards, just empty stalls and hoof prints that ended mid-stride like they'd been lifted out of existence. Then Mason saw it, scrawled on the floor of stall 7 in something black and tar-thick. "She's not yours. She was never yours." His stomach turned, his eyes burned. He raised the lantern and saw something that stopped him cold. In the rafters something moved. No, not something. Someone. Hanging upside down like a bat, skin pale and stretched tight over long limbs. Its eyes glinted like wet mirrors, reflecting the lantern's flame, but showing no soul behind them. A crooked smile stretched across its too wide face. Mason lifted the rifle. The thing dropped. It hit the dirt with a boneless thud, landing in a crouch, its knees backward, its fingers scraping the ground like claws. It cocked its head at him, spoke with a voice made of many. "She told you not to trust the man in the green truck." Mason fired. The creature twisted, faster than anything that size should move. The bullet passed through its shoulder, clean through, and the thing only laughed. "I took the boots as a gift," it hissed. "She wore them to the end, thought they'd protect her. She was wrong." Mason backed toward the door, reloading. "You killed her." "I found her," it replied, grinning wider. "She followed the map to Black Hollow. I only helped her see." "See what?" "What's buried there? What was buried with your father-in-law? What Ezra Crow tried to mine and ran from screaming? What your daughter woke up?" The wind slammed the barn doors shut. Pitch black. The lantern flickered. The creature was gone. Mason's fingers found the red dust pouch. Clara had left it for a reason. He tossed it to the ground. The dust erupted in a circle of crimson light. The thing screamed. Light drove it back, made its mirrored eyes go black. "Fire and faith," Mason whispered, stepping into the center of the circle. "Let's see how you like both." The creature thrashed against the edges of the red dust circle, howling in a voice that wasn't just its own. It sounded like dozens, maybe hundreds, all layered on top of each other. Men, women, children. Screams woven into a single, jagged thread of agony. Mason stood firm inside the circle, rifle raised, his breath ragged in the cold dark. The lantern's flame burned a deep orange, fed by the strange powder on the barn floor. The shadows writhed along the walls, stretching and shrinking like they were alive, recoiling from the light and the dust. "You don't belong here," Mason said, voice low and steady. "This land's mine. Always has been." The creature snarled, rising slowly, its limbs twitching unnaturally. It hovered just beyond the circle, pacing like a caged animal. "It was never yours," it whispered. "Not the land, not the girl, not the blood buried beneath your house." Mason's finger twitched near the trigger, but he didn't shoot. He'd learned long ago, sometimes it wasn't about the bullet, it was about the truth behind it. "Tell me what you are," he demanded. The creature grinned, and in the flickering lantern light, its mirrored eyes cracked, spider-webbing like ice on glass. "I am the echo, the consequence. I am what comes back when you dig too deep." Its voice dropped to a hiss. "And Clara set me free." Mason's gut clenched. "That's a lie." "She woke me up," the creature murmured, almost tenderly. "She thought she could end the sickness. That old mine below Black Hollow. Your family dug something up they should have left alone. She took the map, the necklace, the prayer dust, thought it would seal me again. She was brave enough to die screaming." The rage hit Mason like a freight train. He lunged forward, gun aimed square at the creature's center, but just as he crossed the edge of the red dust circle, the flame in the lantern sputtered. The light dimmed, the circle broke, and the creature smiled. In an instant it surged forward. Mason fired, point blank. The blast slammed the thing back into the barn wall, but its laughter echoed even as it slumped, twitching. Then silence. He stood there, breath catching in his throat, eyes fixed on the twitching shadow on the floor. The body shuddered once, twice, and then crumbled into dust, blown away by a sudden gust that kicked open the barn doors. Mason stood alone in the ruined barn, his rifle still warm in his hands. Then a sound, small, fragile. A bell, coming from the woods. He turned. Out in the field where the corral fence met the edge of the tree line, something glowed, faintly, a soft, pulsing blue light, like moonlight beneath water. And there, just on the path leading into Black Hollow Ridge, stood a figure, slim, barefoot, wearing a tattered riding jacket. Clara. She didn't speak, just turned and walked into the trees. Mason ran after her. He didn't care if it was ghost, dream, or madness. He had to follow. Branches tore at Mason's coat as he pushed through the tree line, chasing the pale blue glow ahead. Clara's silhouette moved steadily, never fast, never far, always just ahead, like she wanted him close, but not too close. The trees of Black Hollow Ridge grew thicker the deeper he went. Their limbs twisted into shapes that looked too deliberate to be natural. The moonlight barely touched the forest floor here. Every step Mason took was swallowed by silence. After 10 minutes, the trail opened suddenly into a clearing, one he hadn't seen in years. A sinkhole, long collapsed, now covered in thick ivy and soft moss. The ground gave off a low heat, like something below was still smoldering. Clara stood at the edge. When Mason stepped into the clearing, she turned toward him. Her face was pale, but real. Her eyes held the same steel his wife used to have, the same fire. "I'm sorry," she said softly, her voice threading into the wind. "I tried to stop it." Mason's breath caught. "Clara, are you—" She didn't answer. Instead, she knelt and brushed the moss away. Beneath it, carved into the rock, was a circle of symbols, shapes he didn't recognize, etched deep and burned dark. In the center, a single hole, wide enough for a man to crawl through. "The mine?" Mason asked, stepping closer. Clara nodded. "The mine. but not like you remember. It's below the mine. Something older. Something they never wrote down in the ledgers. Mason felt the air thicken. The ground pulsed once, like a heartbeat. Clara looked up at him, eyes wet but determined. They thought it was just silver. But it wasn't. It was a door. To what? She hesitated. To the part of the world we're not supposed to see. The part that watches us back. Mason felt cold crawl up his spine. You went in there alone? I had to, she said. I followed the map. I followed Granddad's old claim. I thought maybe if I sealed it, no one else would die. But I failed. The dust, the locket, the symbols, they weren't enough. She held out her hand. In her palm lay the last of the red powder. But you can finish it. You and me. Together. A growl rose behind them. Mason turned fast, raising the rifle. From the trees emerged something wrong, shaped like a man, but taller, thinner, crawling on all fours, bones cracking with every step. Its face was a twisted version of his own, like a memory caught in a shattered mirror. You left the door open, it rasped. Now we all come through. Mason stepped in front of Clara. The dust pouch trembled in her hand. Clara whispered, Say the name. What name? She pressed the dust into his palm, the one on the map. He remembered the etching, the word carved beneath the ridgeline. Foreign, wrong, etched in blood-red ink and sealed in wax. Orash Kel. The creature screamed. Mason spoke the name aloud, and the ground split open. Fire, wind, a roar from the deep that wasn't a sound, but a command. The creature twisted, shrieking, pulled backward toward the sinkhole, its claws digging furrows in the earth. It fought like an animal, like a god unseated. Clara's voice joined his. Orash Kel, return beneath the gate. The red dust burst into light, searing a ring of fire around the hole. The creature fell in, screeching, swallowed by the dark. And then silence. The clearing stilled, the earth sealed, the symbols cooled. Clara stood beside him, breathing hard, her form flickering like a candle in wind. You're not staying, are you? Mason asked quietly. She shook her head. I was never meant to, but I couldn't leave until someone listened. He wanted to hold her, wanted to beg for one more day, but he didn't. He only nodded. Thank you, she whispered, for believing me, for coming. Her figure faded, dissolving into morning mist as the first light touched the ridge. Mason stood alone at the edge of the closed earth, dust clinging to his boots, the memory of fire in his lungs. Then he turned and walked home. This time he left the boots where they were. Let the ridge keep its ghosts. He'd seen enough to know some stories were better left buried. 3 weeks later. The ranch was quiet again, too quiet. Mason sat on the porch swing most mornings now, a cup of black coffee in one hand, the folded map in the other. The red circle had faded, but the name, Orash Kel, was still there, burned into the parchment like a scar that wouldn't heal. The authorities came, asked questions he didn't answer, about the missing livestock, about the busted barn doors, about the shotgun shell casings, and the symbols burned into the floor of stall 7. He gave them what they expected: weather damage, coyotes, trespassers. Nothing to see here. They didn't push. Folks knew better than to dig too deep into Briggs land. He kept Clara's room the same, but sometimes he swore the air in there smelled faintly of leather and lilac. At night he heard hoofbeats near the ridge, not loud, not often, just one set, riding slow, then nothing. He'd left the locket on her pillow. One morning the boots vanished from the porch. No sound, no footprints, just gone. But in their place, a note. Thank you, Daddy. You finished what I couldn't. Be happy now. It wasn't signed, but it didn't have to be. He folded it carefully and placed it in the box where he kept the map, the Polaroid, and the red dust. He never opened that box again. Spring returned early that year. The grass came back greener. The air smelled sweeter. Even the horses seemed lighter in their step, as if a weight had been lifted from the land itself. But Black Hollow Ridge remained off-limits. Mason put up new fencing, fresh barbed wire, warning signs every 10 yards. He knew better now. Some doors don't need to be opened. Some boots don't need to be found. And some daughters never truly leave, especially the ones brave enough to face the dark alone. The day Mason packed away the last of Clara's things, he paused in the doorway to her room, hand resting on the worn doorframe. The late afternoon sun filtered through her lace curtains, catching motes of dust that floated like tiny ghosts. Her old saddle still hung on the wall. The faded ribbon from her first barrel race still clung to the mirror. He hadn't the heart to take them down. Downstairs, the radio crackled, old country, something she used to hum along to. He walked through the house slowly, boots echoing in the silence, each step a memory. Outside, the horses grazed like nothing had happened, like the world hadn't cracked open beneath their hooves. He reached the edge of the field just as dusk began to settle. The sky blazed orange, fading into bruised purple. And there, near the ridge, a shape stood alone. A figure, slim, familiar, not moving. He blinked. Gone. Just shadow and wind. Mason exhaled, not fear, not grief. Peace. He turned back toward the house. Pastor's old collar still hung on the porch post, a silent bell that hadn't rung in years. As he sat down and watched the sun disappear behind the hills, he thought of Clara. Not the way she died, but the way she lived. Wild, brave, unbreakable. The door may have closed, the dust may have settled, but her boots would always echo through this land, and Mason Briggs would always be listening. 1 month later. The grass grew taller near the ridge, refusing to be cut. Mason had tried twice. His mower belt snapped both times, and the old scythe he used left blisters where none should have formed. He stopped trying. Some places, he figured, didn't want to be tamed. He kept to the southern fields now, even repaired the fence line he'd let go for years. Anything to keep busy, anything to stay away from the shadows that crept too close after sundown. But the quiet didn't last. One morning in June, a letter arrived marked. No return address, just his name, scrawled in sharp, careful pen on parchment that smelled faintly of sulfur and sage. Inside was a single sentence. Did you bury the map with her, or did you keep it? No signature, no mark. But the paper felt old, older than any courier would admit carrying. Mason read it once, then burned it. The flame turned blue. That night the horses spooked, all of them. Slamming into their stalls, kicking, frothing at the mouth. One broke through the gate and ran headlong into the pasture, only to collapse at the tree line, its legs twisted beneath it like straw. When Mason got there, the animal was still breathing, eyes wide with terror, but blind. Its pupils were milky. Gone. Mason knelt beside it, whispering soft words from a prayer he barely remembered. The horse didn't move again. He buried it beside Pastor. The next morning, the ridge looked different. A tree had split clean down the middle, blackened from the inside. No fire, no storm, just hollowed, like something had reached into its core and taken the light away. That was the day Mason went back to Clara's grave. He brought nothing but the map, the necklace, the locket. Those had stayed with her. He wouldn't disturb that. But the map that he held in his hand, wrinkled, burned around the edges. The red circle long faded, but the path still visible. He buried it beneath the cedar at her headstone. 6 inches of earth, no marker. Let them come looking, let them dig. The land would deal with them the way it had dealt with Ezra, with Jesse, with whatever wore Mason's face in the barn. He stood for a long time after, his hat pressed to his chest, the air thick with pollen and memory. Then he turned and walked away. He didn't look back. But that night, he heard Clara's voice again. Just a whisper, one word, thank you. Elsewhere, in a dark room far from Black Hollow Ridge, a man with mirrored sunglasses sat at a desk made of bone-white oak. He held a fresh map. This one etched in silver, the edges curling as though resisting the ink. A red circle burned on the corner. Not Briggs Ranch this time, but close. He smiled, and marked a new name beside it. Ashridge Hollow, Livestock Farm, owner J.R. Callahan. Then he stood, and the room grew cold. 2 months later. The days were long and still, but Mason could feel the pressure building, like the sky itself was waiting to break. Birds stopped nesting near the ridge. Coyotes howled earlier in the evening, and the frogs down by the creek had gone silent. Even the wind had changed. It blew east now, uphill, against the grain of the land. Something was coming. The news from Ashridge Hollow reached him through town gossip. J.R. Callahan's cattle were dying without wound or explanation. His dogs refused to enter the barn. One neighbor claimed to see a figure wandering the property line at night, long-limbed, barefoot, and smiling. Mason didn't wait for a letter this time. He packed a rucksack, matches, salt, red dust, a hand-forged cross he found in Clara's old box, and drove east. The land flattened out the closer he got to Ashridge, but the feeling grew heavier. The trees leaned away from the road. The clouds moved too slow. His truck stalled once. No reason, no mechanical fault. Just stopped, as if warned. He reached Callahan's farm by sundown. The gate was open. The fields were empty, not just empty of animals, empty of sound. No insects, no rustling. Even the leaves on the oak trees stood still like they were afraid to move. Mason stepped onto the porch and knocked. No answer. He knocked again. Then he noticed the door ajar by an inch, blood on the knob. Not fresh, but not old either. Thick, dried like tar. He drew his revolver and pushed it open. The smell hit him first. Copper and mold and something sweeter. Rotted pears, maybe. The kind of smell that sinks into walls and doesn't let go. The hallway was dark. The light bulbs broken. He moved slowly, eyes adjusting, each creak of the floorboards echoing like a scream. In the kitchen, a message had been scrawled on the wall in what looked like charcoal. You closed one gate, Briggs, but the land remembers. Below it, a boot print, Clara's size. Mason stared, heart pounding. It made no sense. He buried the boots, buried the map, burned the letter. Was it her? A warning? Or something wearing her shape again? He didn't know. Not yet. But he knew where to go next. 3 days later, Briggs Ranch. He returned to the ridge at dusk. The tree that had split was gone now, just a blackened stump with concentric rings burned straight through the center. At its base, the ground had opened again. Not wide, not deep, just enough to let something slip out. He knelt and whispered the name again, Orash Kell. The air turned colder. A figure stepped out of the tree line. Not Clara. Not the creature from the barn. This one wore a clean white shirt, pressed trousers, a hat too wide for his head. No sound to his step, no scent. His eyes were blank, not black, not mirrored, just void. I have come for the second seal, he said. Mason didn't ask what that meant. He just stood slowly and lifted the revolver. You're not welcome here. The figure tilted its head. It was not a request. Then it vanished. No wind, no shadow, just gone. But in the dirt, where he had stood, a silver coin now rested, stamped with a symbol Mason recognized from the map. The second circle. It had begun again. Back in town. General store, morning. The clerk handed Mason a wrapped parcel. This came for you, Mr. Briggs. No postage, just left at the counter. Mason nodded and took it. Drove home in silence. At the kitchen table, he opened the package. Inside, a photograph of Clara alive and well, standing outside a cabin he didn't recognize. A ring, his late wife Martha's. It had gone missing 2 winters ago. And a note handwritten in crisp, elegant penmanship. She's not lost, not yet. But the ridge is not the only door. When the third seal breaks, you'll need to choose the living or the land. It wasn't signed, but below it, pressed in wax, was a familiar symbol, the circle, burning. Mason stood at the edge of the ridge with the note still clenched in his hand, the wax seal sticky against his palm despite the mountain air. Behind him, the ranch slept under a slate-gray sky, clouds pressing low enough to scrape the barn roof. A storm was coming, real or not, he didn't know, but the pressure in the air felt like memory, felt like grief, felt like warning. He turned the note over again and again in his fingers, the words repeated like a drumbeat. She's not lost. Not yet. The living or the land. The living or the land. The phrase echoed in his bones like something older than language. He tucked the paper away and walked the property lines, checking the fence posts out of habit more than need. As he reached the back pasture near the old burial tree, he saw something glinting near the roots, a small metal tag. He knelt and wiped away the dirt. A dog tag, U.S. Cavalry, issued 1876. The name was worn down, but the number was clear. 1177. He turned it over. There was a mark scratched into the metal, a crude circle with 3 triangles pointing inward, the same symbol from the map, the same seal from the coin. The third. Mason pocketed the tag and rose slowly. He didn't know much about the cavalry, but he knew how to read a sign. Someone, or something, was placing breadcrumbs. He just didn't know if it was trying to help him or lead him straight into the dark. That night the wind didn't blow, the trees didn't sway, the stars didn't come out. It was as if the world had paused to watch. Mason stayed inside, sitting at the table, lantern burning low, the revolver loaded beside his hand. At midnight the front door creaked open without being touched. Mason didn't flinch. He just stood, picked up the lantern, and stepped outside. The porch was empty. The gravel path stretched untouched into the yard, but in the distance, near the ridge, a fire burned. Small, controlled, like a signal. Mason walked toward it, boots crunching softly, each step measured like he was walking across a frozen lake. As he drew closer, he saw the shape of a small campfire, and beside it, a woman sitting cross-legged in the dirt. She was dressed in a long gray duster, hair braided down her back, hands folded in her lap. "You're late," she said. Without looking up, Mason stopped 10 paces away. "Didn't know I was expected." She glanced at him then. Her eyes were pale green, calm, old. "You carry the dust," she said, "and you've spoken the name." "Who are you?" "Doesn't matter. What matters is what you do next." She reached into her coat and tossed something into the fire. The flames hissed and turned black for a moment, rising high, then settling low and red. "There are more doors," she said. "What your daughter stumbled into was just the first. A fracture, a crack in the seal. I closed it." "No," she said simply. "You closed a gate, but the root system runs deep. This land, this place, it was never just soil and stone. It was a lid, and the seals were the nails." Mason swallowed hard. "The third seal. What is it?" She looked up at him, and for the first time her face changed, softened. "The third seal is choice," she said. "When the gate opens, you'll be offered a bargain. A face you love for a price you can't afford." Mason didn't need to ask what face. He already knew. Clara. Alive, or something that would look like her. He stepped closer to the fire. "And if I refuse?" She reached into the ash and pulled something out, a coin like the one he found earlier, but this one glowed with a dull red pulse. "If you refuse, the land remains quiet, for a time. But the darkness finds another way, always does. And if I accept?" "You might get her back," she said, "but you'll never be able to leave, not truly. You'll be its warden, bound to this land until it sleeps again." Mason stared into the fire. The crackling logs whispered like voices just below hearing. He thought of Clara's smile, the boots, the note, the scent of lilac and leather. He thought of the quiet evenings when the world still made sense and the worst thing he had to fear was weather. Then he looked back at the fire and said the one thing he hadn't allowed himself to say since the night she disappeared. "I'd trade anything." The woman didn't smile, didn't nod, just stood. "Then it's coming. Be ready." The flames went out. The fire vanished. And Mason was alone. The only light came from the porch lantern, flickering far behind him. He turned to walk home, but the path felt longer than before. The wind picked up. It carried a sound now. Footsteps, not his. Ahead of him, between the trees, a figure stepped out onto the trail. She wore Clara's jacket, her boots. But her eyes were wrong. Mason stopped cold. The figure ahead stood with her shoulders hunched, arms slack at her sides, her breath misting in the cold. She looked just like Clara, down to the scar on her left brow, the rip in her jeans from the time she'd fallen off whiskey. But her stance was all wrong. She didn't carry herself like his daughter. She wore Clara's body like a borrowed coat. Her eyes lifted to his. They were black, bottomless. "I missed you, Daddy," she said. The voice was right, soft, familiar, the same tone she'd used when sneaking in late from the rodeo, barefoot and mud-caked. But there was no warmth behind it, no flicker of soul. Mason raised the revolver, heart stammering in his chest. "You're not her." She smiled, slow, patient, a serpent watching a mouse pretend to be brave. "I could be," she whispered. The woods around them fell into silence. Even the wind dropped. The trees leaned inward like they were listening. "I could give you back the laughter, the girl who loved you, the life you lost." She stepped forward. "You don't have to be alone anymore." He shook his head. "I'd rather be alone than lie to myself." The not Clara tilted her head. "Even if it meant saving her? She's already gone." The thing smiled wider. "You're wrong." And then, from the trees behind it, another voice called out, "Daddy?" Real, small, afraid. He turned toward the sound, his breath caught. Another Clara. Hair a mess. Blood on her jeans, dirt smeared across her shirt, her eyes wide and terrified. But alive. Human. She was clutching the old locket, the one that had gone into the grave. "Help me," she sobbed. "It's lying. It won't let me leave." Mason's world narrowed. Two Claras, one with darkness behind the eyes, still and waiting, one weeping, shaking, calling out. "Choose," the false one whispered. "One to save, one to bury." He didn't hesitate. Mason fired. The bullet slammed into the creature's chest. It didn't scream, it roared. The illusion shattered, its face twisted and lengthened, skin peeled away like paper in flame, revealing a gaping maw lined with rows of silver teeth. The real Clara ran to his side. He shoved her behind him, grabbing the red dust from his coat pocket and throwing it into the wind. The fire ignited instantly. The creature lunged. Mason stood firm. "Orash Kell," he bellowed. "The gate is closed." The sky split, the trees howled, and the thing was torn back, not by bullets or fire, but by force, pulled like a shadow against its will. It twisted and writhed, its form shattering into smoke and ash. Its scream faded into nothingness. Then silence. Real silence. The kind Mason hadn't heard in years. Clara collapsed against him, sobbing, trembling. He held her tight, felt her heartbeat against his chest, hot and fast and real. "You're safe now," he said softly. But he didn't quite believe it. Not yet. 1 year later, the ranch still stood, fences mended, fields full. Clara planted sunflowers near the porch, her mother's favorite. Mason didn't speak much about what happened, neither did she. But sometimes, on windless nights, they'd sit on the porch and listen to the dark. Pastor's old collar still hung from the porch post. Whiskey's saddle rested on a stand by the barn. The locket remained sealed in a wooden box on the mantel. And under Clara's bed, wrapped in oilcloth and hidden behind old books, sat a map, its edges frayed, its ink faded. But one thing remained clear, a fourth circle. Not red, not silver, just empty. Waiting. Spring had come early to Briggs Ranch, but it hadn't come kindly. The wildflowers bloomed in strange places, clusters of violet and bone white, sprouting in the middle of gravel, in the dry creek bed, even from the dead center of Pastor's old grave. The bees wouldn't touch them. Neither would the wind. They stood too still, like offerings at an altar nobody had built. Clara noticed them first. She'd stopped riding to the ridge, refused to go near the pasture past the old cedar. Mason didn't ask why. He already knew. Some things didn't need to be spoken out loud to be understood. One morning in mid-April, Mason woke to find her standing barefoot in the kitchen, staring out the window. Her coffee had gone cold in her hands. "It's back," she said without turning. He didn't need to ask what. That night the sound returned. Not hoofbeats, not footsteps. Knocking. From beneath the floorboards. Slow, rhythmic, 3 times, then silence. Mason got the shovel from the porch and stepped into the yard. The grass was damp with dew. The moon hung low, orange and swollen like a swollen eye. He didn't speak, just walked to the spot near the barn, where the first body had been buried. The ground was undisturbed, but the knocking had come from deeper now, below, beneath everything. He knelt and pressed his hand to the earth. It felt warm, breathing. He stood and walked the perimeter of the house. Salt still ringed the foundation. The wards Clara had painted were still visible, faint blue smudges under the eaves, but the protection was fading. Time, or something worse, was wearing them down. The next day he drove into town. The general store was nearly empty. The clerk was new, young, didn't know him. Mason grabbed what he needed: canned kerosene, rope, chalk, silver tacks, and a bottle of turpentine. As he paid, the clerk gave him a sideways glance. "Storm coming?" the kid asked. "Something like that," Mason muttered. At home, Clara had drawn new symbols. She used the red dust this time, thicker lines, longer curves. She said they weren't prayers. They were reminders of who was buried and who wasn't. Mason didn't argue. They worked through the night, resealing the windows, chaining the cellar door, laying salt around the barn, the well, the old fence post where the first shadow had stood. But the next morning they woke to find something leaning against the porch railing. A staff, old, wooden, charred at one end, and tied near the top, swaying in the breeze, was one of Clara's boots. Not both, just one. The same one she'd lost the night she ran. It was damp and muddy. Mason and Clara didn't speak as they buried it, 10 feet deep, under lock, chain, and salt. But as they turned to leave, a whisper rose from the trees, not loud, not clear, just a single phrase caught on the wind. "One circle remains." The boot they buried didn't stay buried. By the third morning, the ground had buckled. The chain was gone. The salt scattered like it had been blown outward from the center. Mason dug in silence, expecting rot and leather. What he found instead is ash, just ash, a perfect outline where the boot had been, like something had burned it from the inside out and left the soil untouched. Clara watched from the porch, arms wrapped around herself. Her face was hard, but her eyes were frightened. "We didn't bury it deep enough," she said. Mason didn't look up. "Wasn't the depth," she nodded. "Then what?" He stood. Something called it back. That night Clara woke screaming. He was there before she hit the floor, pulling her up, holding her close. She was drenched in sweat, her fingernails torn, blood crusting around the bedsheet where she'd clawed it. "I saw her," she gasped. "Mama." Mason stiffened. She was standing in the garden, holding a lantern. But her face, it wasn't hers. It shifted, like smoke, like it couldn't decide who to be. She said my name in Mama's voice. Then she said, "We're almost done." Mason laid her back down gently, brushing damp hair from her forehead. He sat in the old rocking chair by the window, rifle across his lap, watching the tree line. In the morning, they found the garden burned in the exact shape of a circle. 12 feet across, blackened grass, wilted sunflowers, a second seal etched in ash. The fourth had begun to form. That same day, a rider arrived. No engine, no headlights. Just a figure on horseback, wrapped in a coat stitched from mismatched hides. The horse was massive, black-eyed, froth on its mouth and dirt caked to its hooves like it hadn't stopped running in a week. Mason met him at the fence with a hand on his holster. The rider dismounted slowly, didn't speak, just handed Mason a small wooden box and turned to leave. "Wait," Mason said. "Who sent you?" The rider stopped. His voice was sandpaper on stone. "There's others like you, ones who've held the circle back. Each was given a piece. You've now got 2. Don't lose them. Don't open them too soon." Then he was gone. Dust in the road. Mason opened the box once he got inside. Inside was a mirror, small, cracked. Its surface rippled, even when still. Etched on the back was a word neither he nor Clara had ever seen. Verocall. When Clara touched it, the reflection changed. Not her face, Martha's, smiling, reaching out, but her mouth was stitched shut. Clara dropped it and ran. Mason picked it up and threw it into the fire. It didn't burn, not even blacken. They buried it behind the barn, 4 feet down, encased in lead. But that night, Mason saw light flickering under the door to the storm cellar, lantern light, and humming. Martha's lullaby, the one she used to sing to Clara when she was too sick to sleep. He unlocked the door slowly. The cellar was empty, but the dirt floor was no longer solid. A new hole had begun to dig itself from the inside out. He slammed the door and sealed it with nails, salt, and blood drawn from his own hand. But deep below, the humming continued. And when he returned to Clara's room, she was sitting bolt upright in bed, whispering a phrase over and over again. "The circle knows. The circle knows. The circle knows." The fourth seal didn't break all at once. It spread like infection, small signs at first. A cold draft through a closed window. A line of salt turned to ash without wind or touch. The mirror box, buried beneath layers of lead and stone, began to vibrate in the ground. Mason could feel it when he walked the yard, his boots pressing down on soft patches of earth that throbbed like they had a pulse. Clara stopped sleeping. Her eyes ringed with red. Her voice became quieter each day, like part of her was receding. She barely touched her food. She barely left her room, but every night she whispered the same thing. "The circle knows." Mason tried everything. He redrew the symbols. He salted every corner of the property. He even lit the red dust in a circle around the barn, letting the smoke rise into the night like a beacon. Nothing changed, or worse, everything did. The animals in town began to vanish. Dogs, cattle, even birds, gone without sound or struggle. The local vet packed up and left without notice, his office door swinging in the wind. The sheriff came by one afternoon to ask if Mason had seen anything strange. Mason told him no, and then watched the man drive off with hands gripping the wheel, like a man holding back a scream. That night, Clara stood in the hallway, pale and barefoot, and handed Mason a piece of paper. It was old, yellowed, torn from the inside of a book. In the center was a diagram, a circle made from 4 interlocking seals, and in the middle, a hand-drawn sketch of something ancient. A gate, not made from wood or metal, but from bone, human and animal, and something else entirely. At the top, in blocky, faded handwriting, was a phrase in Latin. Mason didn't read Latin, but Clara did. She spoke the words aloud with a hollow, distant voice. "Aperiatur porta, veniat radix, sacrificium fiat." Mason didn't need a translation. He knew what it meant. Open the gate. Let the root rise. The sacrifice begins. The next morning, Mason found the cellar door wide open. The mirror box was gone. The earth beneath it was torn up, clawed from below, and leading out from the wound in the dirt were footprints, human, bare, and leading not into the house, but back to the ridge. Clara was missing. Her room undisturbed, her boots still by the bed, her locket still on the nightstand. But the diagram she'd given him was gone. In its place was a single word scrawled in the ash of her bedroom wall: Verukal. He didn't waste time. Mason packed a rucksack with red dust, kerosene, his revolver, and the small wooden totem Pastor had been buried with. He didn't know if it had power, but he knew it carried loyalty, and he would need every scrap of that now. The ridge was darker than before. The trees bent in strange directions. The wildflowers near the base were now shriveled black, and the earth trembled beneath his steps, not shaking exactly, but breathing. Like the hill was alive, and something beneath it had finally woken up hungry. At the summit, the wind died completely. In the center of the clearing stood the old cedar tree, dead now, split completely open from base to crown. Inside its hollowed center was a doorway, a perfect circle carved into the earth, ringed in black ash. Floating above it, no visible support, no hook or frame, was the mirror box. It turned slowly in mid-air, spinning on an unseen axis. Mason stepped closer. Every hair on his body stood on end. The revolver felt like dead weight in his hand. As he approached, the mirror surface began to ripple. Then it cleared. Not a reflection, but a window. Through it, he saw Clara, standing in an underground chamber lit by firelight. Her hands were at her sides. Her eyes were glassy, unmoving, and standing behind her, tall and skeletal, wrapped in tendrils of root and ash, was the thing that had called itself Orash Kell. But it was different now, fuller, stronger, as if feeding off the seals had given it form. It turned its face toward the mirror, toward him, and smiled. The ground split beneath Mason's boots. He jumped back, just as a burst of black flame shot from the roots of the tree. A voice filled the clearing, deep, cold, older than time. 4 have turned, the 5th is blood. Mason raised the revolver, fired into the mirror. The bullet passed through the surface with no resistance, no shatter, no sound. But Clara flinched. Her hand twitched. Her eyes moved, and the creature's smile faded. He fired again. This time, the mirror cracked. The floating box dropped to the ground with a sound like a scream trapped in a bell jar. Clara stumbled forward inside the vision. Her mouth moved. Words he couldn't hear. But her eyes, they were hers again. Mason reached forward. The mirror flickered. A hand touched the inside of the glass. Hers, shaking, bleeding, real. Mason pressed his palm to it. "I'm coming," he said, and stepped into the gate. He landed hard. The air was thick, copper-scented, stifling. The chamber was deeper than he'd imagined. Stone walls pressed close on all sides, roots webbed through every surface like veins, pulsing with black light. The ground beneath him throbbed. He could feel it in his bones, a heartbeat that wasn't his. Across the chamber stood Clara. Her face was pale, her lips cracked, her body wrapped in tendrils of shadow. But she was alive. Her chest rose and fell. Her eyes, though dazed, flicked toward him the second he landed. She opened her mouth, but no words came, only a rasping breath and a tear that slid silently down her cheek. Mason ran to her. Roots lashed out from the walls to block his path. He raised the red dust and threw a line of it across the floor. The moment it touched the stone, flame erupted. The roots recoiled with a shriek of ancient pain. The path cleared. He reached her, cutting the roots free with his hunting knife, one by one. Each slice released a burst of cold wind and a whisper in a language older than stars. When the last root fell away, she collapsed into his arms. "I saw Mama," she whispered. "I saw what she became." Mason held her tighter. "You're not going to become anything. We're leaving. Now." The walls pulsed with laughter, not human, not animal, like rocks grinding against bone. "You cannot leave. You are part of the fifth." Mason turned, placing Clara behind him. The chamber was shifting now, growing wider without expanding, space bending inward. At the far end, the creature stepped forward. Orash Kel, full-bodied now, twice a man's height, its face covered by a curtain of mirrored strands, arms long as spears, its body made of bark, bone, and regret. "You closed one gate," it hissed, "but you opened another. Your blood brought her. Your name carved the map. You were always the final seal." Mason raised his revolver. "Then let's close this together." He fired. The bullet struck the creature's chest and shattered like glass. The creature didn't flinch. Instead, it opened its arms wide. Clara stood. "No," she said softly. She stepped forward, taking the pouch of red dust from Mason's belt. Her fingers were burned. Her mouth was bleeding. But her voice was clear. "You killed Mama. You twisted her soul." Orash Kel turned toward her. She offered herself freely. "No," Clara said, stepping into the center of the chamber. "She was tricked, like you tried to trick me." She poured the last of the dust in a circle around herself. The flames rose high, hotter, whiter than Mason had ever seen. Inside the circle, Clara pulled something from her pocket. The locket. Still whole, still warm. She opened it. Inside were two photographs, Martha and Mason, family, blood. The creature screamed. The circle ignited like the sun. Roots pulled away from the walls, shriveling. The stone cracked. The heartbeat stopped. Mason shielded his eyes as light filled the chamber. The creature tried to run, tried to crawl back into the walls, but Clara spoke the word again, "Veracall." And the light consumed everything. When Mason opened his eyes, he was lying on the ridge, morning sun on his face, the cedar tree gone, the circle gone, just grass, wind, silence. Clara sat beside him, eyes closed, her hand in his. "We're home," she whispered. And for the first time in years, Mason believed her. The ridge remained quiet for 7 days. Clara didn't speak much. She slept through most of the daylight, waking only when the sun dipped low and the shadows stretched long. Mason gave her space. He cooked what he could, kept the ranch in order, and spent his nights seated by the fireplace, the map tucked between pages of an old ledger, the locket sealed in a tin box under the floorboards. But on the 8th morning, the silence broke. Birdsong returned. Grass turned a shade greener than Mason remembered, and when he walked past the old well near the barn, he saw something impossible. Fresh tracks, barefoot, small, leading out from the well and circling once around the stone lip before vanishing. He didn't call Clara. He followed them alone. The tracks led to the edge of the field where Pastor had been buried. There, resting in the grass, was a pinewood box, square, hand-carved, its edges burned, its hinges sealed with pitch. On the lid, carved in a language he didn't recognize, were 4 symbols. Not the circles, not Latin. Older. Mason didn't open it. He brought it inside and set it on the mantel, let it sit untouched. But that night, he dreamed. He saw Clara in the ridge chamber again, standing beneath a ceiling made of stars. But she wasn't a girl anymore. Her hair was white as bone. Her eyes were glowing. Her voice echoed through the dream with the weight of prophecy. "They left a gift," she said. "A warning." He tried to speak, but she raised a finger. Then her voice changed, deeper, doubled. 2 tones in one. "You broke the 5th, Mason Briggs, but there were 7. He woke choking. The pine box was open, empty. Clara stood in the doorway. "They're not done," she said, and her voice was not just hers. Mason rose slowly from the chair, never taking his eyes off Clara. Her outline looked the same in the low firelight. Same height, same silhouette, same curve of the jaw. But there was something different in the air, a weight, a stillness, the kind that falls before a tornado touches down. She stepped into the room without blinking, her eyes fixed on the now empty pine box atop the mantel. Her voice was quiet but layered, as though someone else was speaking through her lungs. It found the space between the seals. That's how it slipped through. Not a gate, not a circle, a crack. Mason's hand inched toward the revolver on the table, but Clara noticed. Her eyes, hers again for a flash, flicked toward his fingers. "No, Daddy, that won't work anymore." She stepped past him. Her shadow moved in the wrong direction. He didn't stop her, just followed. Out the door, into the yard. The sky was overcast, moonless, the stars smothered under cloud like embers beneath ash. She led him to the field, the same field where the mirror box had been buried, where the boot had burned, where Pastor's grave had bloomed with unnatural wildflowers. She stopped at the center, turned slowly, and pointed at the earth. Mason looked down. The grass had died in a perfect symbol, a circle, no longer sealed. This one had broken open, not outward, not upward, down. He dropped to his knees and brushed the soil aside. Beneath the dead grass was stone, black, smooth, etched in lines too fine to carve by hand, the same markings from the pine box. 7 total, arranged like spokes on a wheel. Clara knelt beside him. "There were never 4, she whispered. "That was just the first ring. The rest go deeper, older, through the land, through blood." "Why now?" Mason asked. "Why us?" She stared at the center of the circle. "Because someone opened the first one centuries ago, and someone has to close the last." Mason looked at her face, pale, calm, determined. "You're not really Clara anymore, are you?" Her expression didn't change, but her voice softened. "Not just Clara, but still her, and still your daughter." He swallowed hard. "And me?" She reached out and placed her hand on his chest. "You're the anchor." The stone beneath them pulsed once, then cracked. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a fissure, a seam, a breath. From inside came the sound of something vast rolling over in sleep, a sound older than history. Clara stood, her shadow split in 2 directions. "The 6th is breath," she said, "and it's already begun." By morning, the wind changed again. It howled low across the plains, carrying dust that shimmered faintly in the rising light. Mason watched it swirl along the fence line, dancing between fence posts like it was following something unseen. The sky overhead was streaked with green, an unnatural hue that hadn't belonged there since the day Clara vanished. She hadn't come inside. After the field cracked open, she stood in the same place for hours, unmoving, eyes fixed on the spiral of symbols beneath their boots. When he asked her if she needed food, sleep, water, she only said, "The breath doesn't come from lungs, it comes from memory." He didn't know what that meant. He wasn't sure she did either. But when dusk fell again, she walked to the barn, opened the door, sat in the middle of stall 7, the one that had first held the boots. She waited. That's when the voices returned. Not screams this time. Not the layered whispers that used to crawl through the house after dark. These were clear. They came from inside the walls, from under the boards, from the windmill that hadn't turned in weeks. Mason heard his own name spoken in a dozen different tongues. Briggs, son of dust, sealer, breaker, sacrifice. The words weren't threats. They were announcements, declarations, as if the land was recording his presence. He went to the barn with the shotgun, sat outside the stall, and waited with her. Neither of them spoke. Just before midnight, something moved across the far end of the property. A figure, barefoot, long coat, head bowed, the rider who had delivered the mirror box. Only now his face was visible. It was Mason's, older, weathered, eyes hollowed out by things no man should see. The figure stopped at the fence line, lifted one hand. A ring of smoke spiraled from his palm. It took shape in the air, 7 marks, burning red. Then the figure turned and disappeared into the dark. Clara looked at Mason. "That's the 7th seal," she whispered. "It's us." Mason couldn't sleep. He paced the length of the porch, boots dragging softly across the warped planks, the boards groaning like they were remembering things better left forgotten. The vision of the rider, his own face aged and stripped of soul, haunted every step. That was no ghost, no warning. That was a certainty. If he didn't stop this, he would become that, bound to the land, to the seals, a warden of decay. Clara stayed in the barn. She hadn't eaten in nearly a day. Her skin had taken on the same pale hue as the salt lines around the house, and when she blinked, the air seemed to shift, as if her presence no longer obeyed the laws of time and place. Mason wanted to reach for her, to hold her hand, to bring her inside and lock the doors, but doors didn't mean anything anymore. Not when the seals had been carved into the ground. That night, a new sound rose from the ridge. It wasn't wind. It was chanting, rhythmic, deep, foreign, and coming from beneath. Mason gathered his things, the map, the tin box, the red dust, the last 3 bullets he had left, and walked out to the ridge under a moon the color of old bone. The grass parted as he walked. The stones moved aside. Even the night seemed to hold its breath. When he reached the summit, Clara was already there. So was the circle. And now in its center, the 7th seal glowed, etched into the dirt, into the stone, into the marrow of the land. Clara stood beside it barefoot, eyes closed, whispering something too old for human memory. Her voice wove with the chanting rising from below, like she was answering a question Mason couldn't hear. He stepped forward. "What happens if we break it?" he asked. She opened her eyes. "They wake." He tightened his grip on the revolver. "And if we seal it?" "They sleep." Mason nodded slowly. "Then let's end it." Clara reached into her coat and pulled out the locket. It was open. Inside were new photos, not the ones he'd placed, not Martha, not himself, but Clara, and a child, a little girl, dark hair, wearing his boots. Mason's voice cracked. "Is that—" Clara nodded. "It hasn't happened yet, but it will, if we stop this." The chanting rose, the ridge shook, the seal began to crack down the middle. From below, smoke poured upward, thick and silver, and in the heart of it, Mason saw them, shapes, giants, shadows with crowns of antler and teeth of stone, eyes glowing with memory, the old gods, the first hunger, the breath, the root, the door. Clara turned to him. "You have to choose." Mason stepped to the edge of the seal, the revolver in one hand, the map in the other, the red dust at his feet. And all around him, the land waited. Mason stared into the seal. The ground at his feet pulsed like a living heart, the cracks glowing brighter, the ancient chanting climbing to a fever pitch. Smoke curled upward, wrapping around his legs, warm and cold at once, like fingers searching for weakness. The shadows in the mist watched him. They didn't speak. They didn't threaten. They only waited, like they knew how this would end. He looked at Clara. She wasn't afraid. That terrified him more than anything else. Her eyes were steady, her hands still. The wind blew through her hair but didn't touch her skin. She'd become something else. Still his daughter, but also more. "I have to go down," she said softly. Mason shook his head. "No, we can close it from here. You said—" She reached for the locket, still open in her hand. The image of the child stared up at him, familiar and foreign, future and memory. "I'm the door now," she said. "You're the key, but only if you let me go." The seal split wider. Flames licked the rim, blue and white, pure and old. The voices began to name names, his name, Hers, his father's, his grandfather's. Every Briggs who had ever touched this soil, it was blood calling to blood. The legacy of the land, the price of survival. Mason dropped to his knees, trembling. There's got to be another way. There isn't. I can go instead. Clara shook her head. You're the only one who can close it after I pass through. It has to be someone who remembers everything, someone anchored. If I stay, they'll use me. If you go, they'll win. The light grew brighter. The seal began to rise around them, stone curling upward like petals of a monstrous flower. The gate was blooming, opening, hungry. Clara turned, stepped to the edge. Below, the ancient things moved, waiting for her. Mason looked down at the red dust in his hand. One line was all it would take, just one. He didn't speak, didn't cry. He just reached out, placed the locket back around her neck. Then he drew a wide circle of dust around himself, around the seal, around everything. And he lit the match. The flame caught instantly, rose like wildfire. The old words rose in his throat, not taught, not learned, but inherited, passed from bones and blood. He spoke them. The ground roared. The seal blazed white. Clara stepped forward and fell, not down, through. The gate swallowed her gently. The mist closed in, and then silence. The earth stilled. The circle sealed. The ridge stopped breathing. Mason collapsed, hand pressed against the cooled stone. Above him, the sky cleared, and the land, at long last, rested.